Looking good, Penny.
So welcome everyone to another Barichara Regenerative Finance Lab. Today, what I wanted to do was, in a sense, go back to basics, to a really key concept that should be more commonly talked about. And that I think all of us here have some sense of, but I want to really name it and demonstrate it, which is at the basis of any human regenerative economy is trust between people and their ability to work together. And that this focus on trust is a much bigger deal than it may be given attention in like a regenerative economics course or something, like places where people talk about some of these ideas. So what I wanted to do today is put together a little presentation on how trust is the basis of a regenerative economy, show some real world examples of what's happening in Barichara that shows how that works, so that we can sort of see by examples, and then explore together how we in this group are building trust with each other for things that we might want to do. So it's not so much, and therefore, you could watch this thing in Barichara that's happening, but more like just to have a sort of some inspiration from some concrete examples that give us a space for us to feel into, look at all the beautiful relationships we're building among us. What does that make possible for us to do together? And that this is regenerative finance. And I'm going to be fairly explicit about how building trust between people is the basis of creating a regenerative financial system. And so that's the idea for today. And then from there, I think what'll happen is in our discussion, emerging things that are happening will start to become, appropriate to talk about, and we'll sort of lean into them and have plenty of room to talk about them regarding things that are happening in Barichara. But also, we'll be able to talk about things that are emerging for us in each of our different landscapes that are sort of at a higher than landscape level, are places to do the same thing. So that's what I had in mind to do today. And I maybe want to start by saying that back in 2021, when we did our first learning journey in Earth Regenerators, the first learning journey was about regenerative finance. It was an introduction to regenerative finance. And one of the key ideas that I knew at a sort of intuitive level, but hadn't really seen taught specifically, was that the way that we can understand regenerative finance is to look at it in the non-human world. And then when we see a regenerative finance in the non-human world, it gets us unstuck from the idea that finance is about money. Because we're so conditioned in our modern economy to think that finance and money are related to each other, that there's a tendency to unconsciously bring money into discussions of finance, even though financial systems don't have to have any money at all in them, and which is a really interesting observation. And I want to start there because it shows us how you really build a regenerative financial system is focusing on the relationships. And then money may or may not enter, which is what's interesting. Is you can have all kinds of community exchanges that don't involve barter, that don't involve money, that never require you to give numerical value to something and say that they're equivalent values. All of that stuff is baggage from capitalism and baggage from market systems in general that is not necessary for an economy. And all I mean by that is there are plenty of economies that are not markets and that don't use money. And this goes deeper than it's a deeper level of thinking about economics. And that doesn't negate the value of those things. Like a market could be a very valuable thing. It's just that when we go to the deeper level, we discover we have a lot more we can work with. Especially when you're in a context where there's very little money, or the scarcity of money is one of the reasons things don't get done. There are ways to bypass that even without bringing money in. And so that's going to be part of what we're going to talk about today. So let me just jump in and go right into the presentation, which I don't think is going to take too long, maybe 15 minutes. And then we can have a really nice discussion afterwards. Does that sound good? Or are there any questions before we start? Cool. All right, then let's do it. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is the financial flows of trust in community. And this framing for me is really important. The flows is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about flows of finance, but we're going to talk about flows of finance as trust and as community processes. So you can see like sort of constructing an idea of finance from trust in community by looking at how trust flows. And when you look at how trust flows in a community, you see the kind of core architecture of a financial system that you could then financialize. You could do financial things with. And that's sort of what I want us to talk about today. And so to do this, I wanted to sort of name what is finance in its most generic form. Finance for me is the storage, transformation, and movement of value in a network of relationships. So let me break this down. If we were talking about money, this is a kind, or as built capital, or people have tools or knowledge, any kind of value, value can be stored. Someone or something can hold value. Value can be transformed. I could give money to receive food at a restaurant so that the value of my labor, which led to me receiving money, is then converted to someone else's labor to make food, to then receive food to nourish my body, and the value is being transformed. So there are many, many ways that value can be transformed in economic exchanges, and that there's this movement of value in a network of relationships. And finance is how we understand all of these ways that value works, that value exists and is stored within a context, that it can change forms, and that it can move between actors or parts or relationships within a network of interactions. And when finance is that, it's this really general thing, then we can look at an example of a real world financial system that would be a surprise for most economists today, but would not be a surprise at all to an ecologist. So let's look at a real world financial system. This is a real world financial system. This is a food web. In the food web, the primary creator of value is sunlight, which is the energy that creates photosynthesis, that enables microorganisms to convert that sunlight with minerals that are in their environment into a form that small creatures like shrimp could eat. And as those shrimp are eating these microorganisms, these algae that are actually producing light from sunlight, that the energy is being transformed from one body to another. And you could actually follow the entire food web, and you would find there would be this web of relationships and exchanges between energy, materials, and structures and processes and relationships, and that this food web is actually a financial system. It's a financial system because there's value all over the place. There's value that's stored in the bodies of the organisms. There's body that's stored in the thermodynamic potential of the sun. The sun keeps producing sunlight. There's value that's stored in the chromosomes of the algae, because the algae are structures in the environment that can transform sunlight to make simple sugars. And also the value can change forms. It can change from the form of algae to shrimp to small fish to tuna to large sharks or anything else that's in this food web. And that also the energy is moving around continuously in the interactions and relationships of the agents that exist in this food web. And so when we see a financial system in this way, we start to realize that finance becomes mostly about understanding reality. What is real that has value? How is value stored? What are the relationships that lead to the transformation of that value from one kind of a thing to another? And now, all of a sudden, immediately, we're doing ecological economics. So I started this way because oftentimes, if we know about economics, we've learned neoclassical economics or some other thoroughly debunked and unscientific ideology that's not based on reality. And then we bring the baggage of that ideology to our economic thinking, and then we end up with some pretty stupid and pathological economic interventions. But if we see real economies as actually just being equivalent to that an ecosystem is an economy, that a thermodynamic system is an economy of energy, then we see how economics works based on reality directly. And in this way, we can design and build financial systems as a part of an economic system by building it directly from reality itself, rather than some economic theory of value creation or something. Hey, Chris, I see your hand raised. What is it you want to throw in here?
Uh, Joe, I just wanted to ask a real quick question for folks that are potentially naive like me. Can you remind me of the definition of economics relative to finance? So it was interesting listening to your language because you were talking about financial systems and then started talking about economies and I'm remembering that if I was pressed, I wouldn't be able to define the
Oh,
difference.
so the modern world is full of dichotomies that are completely insane. And they're just stupid at face value. One of these is that economics excludes finance, it excludes government. Basically, they're not part of the economy in neoclassical economics. And this is because neoclassical economics is based on statistical physics from the 1880s. And the assumption of something like the law, in quotes, of supply and demand requires there to be equilibrium of price, what's called Pareto equilibrium, for those of you who know your economics. And this equilibrium is assuming that the market has come to equilibrium. See how stupid that is? Because real economic systems are living systems, and living systems, by definition, are always far from equilibrium. The definition of life is that it keeps itself far from thermodynamic equilibrium. So for economics to maintain these absolutely stupid assumptions from the 19th century, finance is separate from the economy. Laws and government are separate from the economy. If you studied neoclassical economics in an economics department in university, the finance department is separate from the master's in business administration, is separate from the economics department, because finance is, quote, not part of the economy. Now, I know that's stupid, but just go look at the course offerings of universities. It's also real. And so for us to think of money as being the equilibrium of price in an equilibrium market system, we've already violated the truth that all economies are living systems, which is why ecological economics, behavioral economics, and several other, there's this weird thing called heterodox economics. Heterodox is a word for everything that's not neoclassical economics, which basically is where all real economics science is done. Because neoclassical economics is an ideology and it's based on completely outdated empirical assertions. Like the idea that the government's not connected to the market, as if they're separate. That's like empirically invalidated by simple observation, but it's theoretically required for the assumptions of neoclassical economics. There are great books out there on this. The Origin of Wealth. I'm getting those last. Anyway, I could find some books for you if you want to dig into complexity and ecological economics. It's freaking awesome stuff. But this is why finance is defined as being separate from the economy for stupid historical reasons in the field of economics.
Well, and just maybe a quick follow-up. I'm just thinking the Capital Institute, right? John Fullerton's work. If I'm remembering correctly, he has a regenerative finance course and a regenerative economics course. So
Yeah,
I'm not even sure what the difference,
but then if you look at what his 8 principles of regenerative economy, he's actually showing you it's a living system and that it's got edge effects, it's got honor and community in place, it seeks equilibrium, but it never reaches it. So it's like he's actually taking a complexity economics lens. But yeah, finance is treated as separate because since the mid 1970s, a bunch of personal financial instruments were created, and we basically financialized the entire planet. We put numerical monetary value on everything on Earth since the mid 1970s. Whereas mostly we were not doing that before. That's where GDP, there's a whole set of conversations we could have.
yeah, I don't want to derail you. I didn't realize it was a
but, but,
complicated.
but it's important to name that finance is treated as its own, finance is a, quote, sector of the economy. Like, what does that even mean? Just think about it for a second. Like, what does that even mean? Like, isn't like finance the circulatory system of the economy? How can it be a sector? So you end up with these weird things like that, that once you name them, you see how silly they are. But it's just sort of weird. And this is why we have so many stupid policy frameworks, like policy frameworks that, like, who would think that was a good idea? Well, because someone was trained in these reductionistic ways. We could have a whole conversation about academic departments and reductionism of knowledge. We could totally go there too. But this is why finance is treated as separate from the economy. And yeah, maybe I'll let it stand there. You can just percolate on what happens when you assume that. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Joe.
So yeah, all right. I'll jump back in and keep going. But that was a great question. So thanks for that, Chris. All right. Here. So rolling on. So we've got a real world reach. This is a regenerative finance system. Its value is stored, it's transformed, it's flowing and exchanging all over the place. So what does this tell us about human regenerative finance? Well, humans are the most social species on Earth. Like there's no comparison. Ants do not bond and form complex collaborative relationships like we do, even though ants are amazing. And so humans do really amazing things by the way we work together, which means the basis of a human economy is trust. If we are able to come together and trust each other, then value flows between us. And let's just look at this picture. There's a picture of a mother and her newborn child, right? Or her young child who's maybe like 6 months old. And what you can see is there's an exchange of value in the hormones. The mother is getting endorphins that feel good, and so is the baby, right? The baby is getting security, and the mother is getting a sense of connection and purpose and identity. And, we could just go on and on. There's a whole bunch of value being exchanged in a mother holding her baby and the baby feeling happy and loved. And any of you who have been around a newborn baby, you also know that the mother's body and the baby's body are continually exchanging hormones through the mother's milk, through the mother's blood pre-birth, and through the milk post-birth, and that it actually alters the biochemistry of the mother and it alters the biochemistry of the baby, and literally biochemical values being exchanged through breast milk. And so that is a regenerative finance system. If we can understand a mother hugging her child as a regenerative finance system, then we're starting to get how important trust is. Like, what if this mother didn't trust herself to be a mother, so she didn't hold her baby? What if this baby was never held, so the baby didn't feel trusted, didn't feel that it could trust its mother and didn't feel secure? Then it would form a weak emotional attachment, and then they'd have all kinds of behavioral problems later. So a healthy relationship between mother and child for humans requires trust. And trust is this context in which all of these flows of healthy relationships can occur. So the very basis of trust in a human economic system is as basic as a mother actually holding her child instead of just leaving it crying on the ground. And so this is why when we talk about regenerative finance, we have to humanize a lot of things. Not to be myopic about humans, because regenerative finance involves all living systems, but just to recognize that if humans are part of a regenerative economy, that trust is a foundational element. And so let's look at an example of regenerative finance based on trust that happened last week. This is a very real example. Because last week, Penny had dengue fever. I did too, but I didn't have to go to the hospital. Penny had to go to the hospital. So Penny had this group of people who did a rotation every 8 hours. One of them would go to the hospital to stay with her. So every 24-hour period, 3 of these people would come and stay with her at the hospital, and this lasted for 3 days. And so when Penny had dengue fever, all of these people who love her, who trust her, she trusts them, they all came together to be sure that Penny survived a severe case of dengue. And just notice that this is a financial system, because all of the elements are in place for value to flow across these relationships in the community. So the people in this picture from left to right, Yvonne in the bottom left, then Ceci to the right, then Sergio, then above to the left is Tanya, and to the right is Natalia. These are the people who actually were at the hospital with Penny. And while they were going back and forth to the hospital with her, other people in the community were bringing me food so that I could rest and be fed while I was recovering at home. And notice how there's a lot of value stored in these relationships. Penny's relationship to Yvonne, Yvonne's relationship to Ceci, every one of these relationships holds value. That value is transformed from love for someone to actively showing up and sitting at the hospital with them, helping translate for the doctor, the value that's stored in cultural knowledge of the hospital system, and so on. There's all these ways that value is stored, transformed, and exchanged between people, which means the support system for those 3 days of keeping Penny alive at the hospital is a financial system. It's a regenerative finance system based in trust. And so this is where we can see that there was a lot of work that had to happen to build these relationships so that at the moment Penny got sick, all of this financial value could flow into a newly created support system of 3 days of emergency response to take care of Penny in the hospital. Where did all of that structure and all of that value come from? Well, in this case, this group of people are also among the founders of Fundación Barichara Regenerativa, which means for the last few years, we've all been working together in very complex environments, and we've built a lot of trust with each other. So that when Penny and I started dating and Penny moved to Barichara, there was this extension of the way everyone valued and trusted me was transferred to Penny. And then Penny started building her own relationships with these people, and they were able to come to her aid when she was sick. And so notice how we've talked about this before, that our foundation, Barichara Regenerativa, is organized around regenerative education, regenerative economy, ecosystem regeneration, but it's also organized around cultural regeneration, which includes territorial healing processes. Well, this group of people going to the hospital with Penny was an ad hoc 72-hour territorial healing process. So the work of our territorial foundation was to come and stay with Penny at the hospital for 3 days. This is a regenerative economy. So if I go back, this right here is a regenerative economy. It's a regenerative economy with a financial system and the value flows among all the relationships to keep one person healthy as part of a community. So you see how powerful these real world examples are to make it visceral, that as we're building a regenerative economy in our territorial foundation, that this way of building an economy created an emergency response healing situation for Penny when she was in the hospital last week. Penny was actually literally driven to the hospital in Yvonne's car with Natalia and Ceci was the one who stayed at the hospital. And so this support system self-organized adaptively as a regenerative economy to create the healing environment that was needed for Penny's dengue fever. And this system only lasted 3 days, but it was absolutely vital, as Penny could attest. She could tell you all about it. But I wanted you to see this as an example of a regenerative economy and of regenerative finance, so that we can see how it's all based in trust. Without trust, none of this would have happened. And so when we look at another kind of work that we're doing in Barichara, which is creating this new nonprofit, Tierra Sagrada, I want to talk a little bit about how trust is essential in this. So just as a reminder, Tierra Sagrada is the organization that Penny and I are creating that its mission is to help bring private land into the commons in service to the regeneration of our territory. There's a lot of things we could say about how we're structuring it and how it works, but what I want to focus on for now is that this organization is emerging from a previous history of building trust over the last 5 years. In the last 5 years, we've had conflicts, we've had trust break down, we've built trust up in general, we've rebuilt trust when there were conflicts, and we identified a lot of things like, how do you create clear agreements? How do you navigate different perspectives? How do you bring people together into frameworks of collaboration that didn't exist before around the management of land for the regeneration of watersheds and forests? And we're going to bring all of that learning from building trust into this organization whose purpose is to help people collaborate with each other to regenerate land at a larger level than private land, like say collaboration among neighbors in a watershed and things like that. And so for us to do that work, we have to take the history of building trust and then leverage it forward. The way we're doing that is we're now laying the groundwork for a profound cultural transition that I'm going to talk about in a moment on the next slide. But this profound cultural transition is to decolonize people's relationships to land and do lots of trauma healing work so that people can collaborate with each other at the landscape scale. So to do that work, we have to build a lot of trust. And so we're weaving social relationships across land-based projects, like how the land Totumo that we just bought, and I'll talk about this more in a moment. How could we partner with our neighbors to do something to restore the water? We want to create social relationships across land-based projects so that we can work at a landscape scale. And so when you look at a picture like this, what I want you to notice is that there's a trail and that there are stone fences on either side of the trail. Why are there stone fences in Colombia? The answer has got a very specific historical significance, which is this. The colonizers came to Colombia starting 500 years ago, and as they increasingly colonized these landscapes, killing or displacing the indigenous people, they eventually brought livestock. And when they brought cows and goats, people needed to build fences to keep their cows contained in an area. So these fences are the artifacts of a process of colonization based on land use change to go from a food forest kind of economy to a livestock agricultural economy that requires physical containers for the livestock. Because if I have corn in my field and you have cows in yours, we need a fence between them or else your cows could walk in and trample my corn. So the very existence of fences is an artifact of a colonizer pattern of livestock management brought over from Europe. So what gets created when you start to build fences? Well, until around the 1970s in Colombia, no one had legal deeds and there were no public records offices. Everyone in Colombia managed their land through social arrangements among people. There was no private land ownership. Private land ownership was created during the period of violence in Colombia when warlords killed people and took control of land. And then they established public records, wrote their own land deeds, issued those land deeds with boundaries around land management. And as a result, Colombia has the most unequal land ownership in its population for any country on earth. And that is evident in the way that the deeds place boundaries on land and people put up fences to defend those territorial boundaries. Most of this was created in the last 50 years in Colombia, and it was created from war, conquest, terrorism, and death of people, and warlords conquering and dominating land and building fences. So the undoing of all of this is the building of trust between neighbors to make these fences irrelevant. Because we don't need fences if there are no cows. And if I have a food forest and you have a food forest, we actually want the native mammals to be able to migrate between them as part of a healthy forest. So you can see that the mindset of how we relate to each other is fundamentally different depending on the paradigm of management. And so building trust in human relationships is part of this cultural transition from private land ownership to community ownership of land or to community management of land, which is why trust is at the core. Building trust between people around shared purposes at a landscape scale is also going to lead to the tearing down of fences in this territory if we're successful. So let's look at the land Totumo that Penny and I just bought 2 months ago. And I've talked about Totumo before. It was a community alternative school for the last 9 years. These are some pictures I took yesterday when Elise and I went there and planted a coconut palm. And I just think, like, when you look at this land and you see, well, this is a private piece of land with borders. The land has boundaries and there is a deed. But if you look at where Totumo is relative to the landscape, there are ecological connections. If we want to restore this watershed, the physical boundaries of Totumo don't really matter. What matters is, can we work with our neighbors? Can we build trust and common purpose with the people upstream, next to us, and downstream from us? So we're already thinking of Totumo not as a contained boundary of place, but as a node in an ecological web of relationships where we need to go out and build trust with our neighbors. So we're already thinking about building trust to build regenerative financial flows and regenerative economic models with our neighbors. And so now if you add in something like Sueños del Bosque, you'll see again that we're going to need financial support for the next year to pay our teachers. Who's going to do that? So we have a small team within Sueños del Bosque that's designing new income streams, but these income streams are built around the idea of creating community programs of various kinds. which is we want to build a tapestry of relationships in the community with people who support our school because they're part of a community. So in October, for example, Juan Peterson, who's a member of our team, is going to offer a program in outdoor adventure education for kids to learn rock climbing, because that's something he's expert in doing. But then in December, he with another group of people are creating a 3-day immersion in cultural art to celebrate local artists and local textiles and local ceramics to preserve cultural knowledge and weave the community with Sueños del Bosque, but also people from the outside can come as a kind of tourism and learn these and pay for these programs to put money into our education fund. And you can see that all of this is built around webs of human relationships and human exchanges. People have to trust the quality of the people teaching their courses. If you had a 7-year-old kid, would you allow them to go rock climbing if you didn't trust the guide who's going to take the kids rock climbing? And you'll see that the development of these business models is still about trust. So for us to solve our problem of needing financial support and creating new financial and business models is about building trust with different networks of people who support our learning ecosystem in Barichara. And so these are a few examples of trust that creates flow and exchange in the community. And so now we can talk, I would like to have a discussion about how we build more trust that builds value flows in this way so they can emerge in new creative ways and create new potentials among us. So you can see that there are several ways within Barichara that the building of trust between people enables new kinds of economic models to form. And this happened emergently for Penny in the hospital. We don't normally think of that as an economy, but it is. There's a lot of value exchanged in keeping Penny healthy and well during those 3 days in the hospital. And by the way, just as a little comment, Penny was astonished when she got the hospital bill. She paid $400 for 3 days of emergency care at the hospital. All of you in the US will be like, what? She would have like paid $30,000 or gone in debt for life or something. She's got international insurance. It's not even worth the trouble of applying for it to pay the $400 bill. So the money part of what happened is the least interesting part. It's the value flow and the trust between us. That's why I'd love to just open it up now to conversation like, what does this prompt in you? What does it reveal? Do you have examples from your own life of regenerative finance when we understand it in this way? How, just by coming together now, like in this call, how are we building the kinds of trust to let us create different kinds of economic exchange? We're like, Chris has muscles. Chris could come to Barichara and dig holes to plant trees. That'd be an economic exchange based on trust as a sort of crude example. But you see, like, this is the idea is once we understand this way of thinking and how deep and how pervasive it is, we can create economic models all over the place, like all over the place. So I'd love to just open it up to discussion. Like, what's the stimulate in you? What do you see us doing, whether it's in the design school, Barichara, whatever, in your own community? Just love to have a conversation about it. And also at any time, Penny, if you'd like to share your experience of being part of that process last week, that could also be powerful. But whoever would like to share. Brian, please.
There's so much here, and it's so different to the way that I'm thinking, the way I grew up thinking. And I think that that's the challenge for all of us. One of those things is the basic concept we work with is an equal exchange of value. And when you're trying to define value, we've simplified that process by reducing it down to one thing. We call it money. And that's how we can equalize the exchange. And so how do you measure trust? And do you even want to measure trust? And how do you establish reciprocal flows of value per an agreement? And such that both parties can feel confident that, yes, that was an equal exchange. I feel good about it. Or maybe I gave a little too much, or maybe you didn't give enough, or you gave too much. Or yeah, how do you do that without being able to measure it? And the challenge is now, how do we measure trust? And there's different kinds of trust also. we can probably, decompose it in order to understand it. And there was something that I heard from Eric Harris Braun. He was on a podcast, and he's a holochain guy, and a brilliant guy. And he was talking about money and one of the challenges of money. And he equated it to, what if we characterized our health with one parameter? And doctors, in his example, doctors used inches. And so, so now inches was the measure of a person's health. And so like weight he used could be, inches from a fulcrum, from a, on a scale type of thing. And how tall are you, and inches grown and inches of your finger and things like that. And if we tried to use inches as the metric for our health, that's just totally ridiculous. And yet that's how we use money, is this single metric to describe these complex relationships. And so your presentation, Joe, just really underscores the challenge that's before us. Yes, it's there. Yeah, we can see it. There's living systems examples of which you presented a couple already, and many of those. And now, wait a minute, what is this going to do to our ability to make agreements with each other, to exchange values, long distances, and everything else? And that's what I'm left wondering, is just these huge questions that I don't have any answers.
Well, I'd love to give a quick answer in two parts and then pass it to Chris. One is, if you look at Elinor Ostrom's core design principles for governing the commons, one of them is equitable distribution of contributions and benefits. Notice how equitable is partly measurable and partly perception-based. Basically, people will keep participating in a commons if they perceive it to be equitable, which means there can be different ways of measuring, as long as there's a general felt sense that is shared that is equitable. And so that's that. You can see there's a complexity to that, but it's also, there's a kind of a concreteness to it too. Like if I have more, I can give more, and maybe that's okay. If I feel okay about it, but maybe you don't feel okay that you're getting more than you're giving, so you need to find some other way to give more. The perceptions can be different. And it's healthy as long as it's dynamic and adaptive. And equitable is different from equal. It's equitable. And so that's already a nuance, a level of nuance. The other thing I wanted to say is, in Casa Común, which is the place where our Center for Economic Transformation in Barichara, which there's a lot we could talk about Casa Común, but there's one specific thing that they decided to do. They wanted to create a community fund with about 100 local producers engaging in exchange so they could start to prototype a community currency. And this is a process that's unfolding, and you can imagine it's got lots of parts to it. But one of the things that they chose as an ethical basis was that they would trust, if someone says they need something, they would trust them at face value. They did this as a practice. And as a practice, what it did was it created really weird perversions in the old economic framing, but that were really obvious in a community. So if you have two different people that bring the same product, that's an input into another product. Like one of the things they make in Casa Común is granola, and some people bring pineapple that then gets dehydrated to become an input into making granola. So there might be two different farms, they bring pineapple. One of the people says, well, my family is doing pretty well. We've got a nice agroforestry project going. We don't have that many expenses. If I just get this much money, I'll feel good. I'm getting a lot of value from this. I'll just give my pineapple. And if you give me this small amount of money, that's fine. But someone else bringing the same quality of pineapple says, well, my mother's sick and I have to pay for these drugs for my mother to be well. I have more costs, so I actually need more money. That transparency, the same product, the input of pineapple has two different prices. And no one thinks that's unfair. They're like, well, of course, Jorge needs twice as much money because his family's got medical issues. And because of the way that they're distributing the equity in that process, which is a multi-capital, has multiple kinds of value in it, that basing it on you trust what people say they need is a way of building trust and healing trauma around money within a community process, because this is a community learning space where they're doing it. And so there are many facets of learning, of infrastructure, of marketing and packaging design, and all kinds of things that Casa Comuna is providing. They're not just giving you money for your pineapple, they're giving you this very rich learning environment with lots of value, way beyond just how much money you get for your pineapple. So some people like, I need 10 pesos, I need 10,000 pesos. Another says, I need 20,000 pesos. And everyone's like, I trust you because I trust that your need is real. And by doing it in that way, they were able to build a community exchange system, not based on the numerical value of money. So just as an example of how equity based on need created clarity that price is different for each context. And that the system not only supports it, but encourages it. Tell us your need. If you need more, tell us. Because if your needs aren't met, you can't participate. But I have to trust you when you say it, you're not going to take advantage of it. And so there's this way that they actually learn to trust by practicing in that way. But that's a really clear example where we violate numerical equivalency. We violate it intentionally. The same pineapple has two different prices, but that's okay. Because it's a set of people working together. It's not an anonymized market. We know who these two people are. They sat at the same table and asked for it at the same table, and everyone knows. And we all feel it was equitable. So that's just an example of how that works to show you that in practice, there are real ways to do this. But yeah, isn't it just so rich, that whole topic? Chris, over to you.
Thanks for that, Joe. It's raising a number of thoughts in my mind. One thing I've been thinking about that I think is related here is well, I'll start with a quick story. I was at an event in town here just the other night that was about a facility that's in southern New Mexico called the Waste Isolation Pilot Project. It's basically a 10,000 year repository for nuclear waste. And there was a very rich and complicated discussion there between the community and the Environmental Protection Agency here in the US. And to make a very long story short, the state of New Mexico has this addiction to oil and gas, which then creates all these distortions in the economy here, also to nuclear weapons. Basically, the two major nuclear weapons laboratories in the state, their budgets combined is larger than the state's budget in total. So we have a very bizarre, and distorted economic context here, right? And I bring that up just because I'm thinking about just in the state in general, just in terms of transformation, right? How do we migrate from these existing systems and by the cultivation of natural capital start to transition us off of this kind of drug dependency, if you will, on oil and gas, on the nuclear weapons complex, and so on and so forth. And so I'm thinking about all of what you just shared there, and particularly, and this may sound a little convoluted, I think all these pieces tie together, may not articulate it very well, is I'm thinking about scale as well, right? So, as probably many folks on this call, we have this notion of the Dunbar number, right? It's like humans can, have rich relationships with up to 150 people. And so I'm thinking about how do we think about what you just described at a much larger scale? So, if we're talking about let's say the relationships between a rural context and an urban context, if we're talking about a city that maybe, 500,000 people or maybe several million people, what is kind of that living systems thinking that allows us to build up to that scale? Or do we say, for example, that cities and all the complexities around that that's actually made possible by our current economic thinking, and maybe there isn't a living systems analog, and maybe cities have to, as they're currently conceived, need to go away, and that we have, a distribution of population looks very different. So anyway, there's just a number of things that sounds somewhat incoherent, but maybe the kind of the macro question is really around scale, and how do we kind of bring this thinking in to kind of remove some of these existing distortions in these kind of really complicated landscapes. Hope that makes some sort of sense.
Makes total sense to me. I'd love to hear what other people think as well. But one comment I can make is that evolution, for the creation of complexity in living systems, evolution addresses the complexity barriers. When it gets to a barrier where it cannot become more complex, it addresses it through this parallel and simultaneous process of modularity and integration. Modularity arises and integration at a higher level arises. Think of like your organs, making organ systems. There's modularity and there's a higher level integration, and they're both occurring. And so part of how we can think about this, if we go back to Elinor Ostrom's work to sort of work within the governing of the commons, Elinor Ostrom identified 8 core design principles, and the 8th one is collaborative relationships between groups, which gives rise to what she called polycentric governance, which is how you can have these multiple centers of decisions that are coherent and they hold complexity. And so when we start to think about what does that mean in practice, like let's go back to Totumo. I told you like Totumo is this little like, tiny 3,000 square meter. It's like, an acre of land. It's small, but it's part of an ecological corridor that is defined by a watershed. So we can start to organize around the watershed and create collaborative relationships in that watershed. The way that we created that is a modularity for that watershed, but some of the things we learned are replicable to the watershed next to it. And then we can create integration around watershed planning at a higher level than a single watershed for 2 neighboring watersheds to coordinate. And so you can start to see that modularity and integration come about through this way of governing the commons with multiple centers of decision making. And that trust is necessary in all of them, which means that modularity is going to tend to honor something like the Dunbar number. You're going to tend up having the capacity to coordinate and manage information up to a certain level of complexity because of the modular context you're in. Higher level, people are actually managing the coordination between those modules, not the modules themselves. And they can have a cap on the complexity of that piece of the work. And this is how humans can scale to higher levels of complexity in social organization. We don't actually violate the Dunbar number to have a city. Because if you look at how we actually manage things, there's actually a power law relationship of how you bifurcate management into different divisions as you grow the size of an organization. So you end up with the Coca-Cola company with 200,000 employees has a whole bunch of divisions, right? They're not like a single decision maker directing 200,000 people. There are probably 500 marketing departments in 200 different companies, all divided within their portfolio, et cetera. So there's like that self-organizing management structure doesn't violate the Dunbar number. But you have to have modular functionality to see how it works.
Maybe just a quick follow-up to that. I guess then really kind of my sticking point, like that all makes sense from a management point of view, but then if we're talking about financial flows, particularly that are non-monetary in nature, I think where I'm struggling is thinking about how that works in a long distance framework. Like the stories that you're telling to me are very proximate, but if it's like multi-hop, then that's where I think I struggle in thinking about that.
Yeah, and it may be that it doesn't work, or maybe that something like blockchain, where you basically have some kind of accounting or tracking system that is trustworthy as an intermediary. But those are separate conversations because they each end up with their own richness to them. Yeah, this is why we need to think about information commons and governance, and it's all entangled in practice.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Joshua, over to you, and thanks for your patience.
Well, this is a really rich conversation. Hopefully you guys can hear me. My internet is not the best right now. So let me know if I cut out. Okay, great. Yeah, as I'm listening to this. Thanks for the presentation, Joe, and for the conversation. I'm thinking about, I'm living in a new place. I'm in the biggest city I've ever lived in my life. And it's a change because I usually live in either suburban areas or very rural areas. And I've lived in some cities, but nothing to hit. This is 8 million in Bogota. And I am in like very, city confines where I feel like I can't see the landscape, because I have everything else around me. I have houses and I have multi-leveled housing and lots of different things around me. There's a park in front of me. There's parks in back of me. I can see the parks, but then all of a sudden I see the next building. And so I'm trying to understand how this works for me just by getting, some regenerative finance systems up, as well as understanding how a regenerative economy can work in a very urban area, to be able to see how that value spreads and how the trust actually allows that to spread as well. And so what I'm thinking right now is like there's a few different things that I want or even need to get done within this current to establish myself here. One is I really don't like having my food waste get put into the trash, and I want to be able to actually share that, put that value back into the soil as quickly as possible. There's not a lot of food. Well, I need to get it into the systems
Well, look at this. I'm
myself,
going to
but
give you an example right now. I know the exact person who created the exact organization to solve exactly that in Bogota. Her name's Natalia Lopez, and I need to introduce you to her. To create eco
yes.
from home composting for urban use in the city. And they've already done it. And so see, just by you telling me what you need and me going like, I met the woman who does, they created this really innovative B Corp. And so anyway, this is why our relationships matter. But if you didn't just mention that example, I would be like, oh, I'll introduce you to Natalia now. She's really cool. Because they actually created a business, they created a nonprofit and a business that does exactly what you're talking about in the city of Bogota. So these edge effects are super important. You and I were just on an edge where I'm touching some of the innovation work in Bogota. So I know this person by sheer happenstance relative to you, but you and I know each other. And you just mentioned it as an example. And at the edge, there's a flow. I can connect you with Natalia Lopez and her company that does this. And so anyway, just want to name that. And this gets to Chris's thing. This is at a distance. Joshua and I have never met in person. And so, but you can see how, anyway, but please continue. But I will connect with Natalia after you said that.
No, that's perfect. And it's something that's is, super needful right now. Right. And I think it does answer that question to Chris. It's like, it's the degrees at which, your 100 or so people that you surround yourself, you're not always going to overlap with those 150 people are not going to, in fact, it doesn't ever work that way where it's such a contained force. My 150 are going to be different than your neighbor's 150, than, someone across the street, and it's going to spread. My 150 right now is probably very, spread out globally because I'm really focused on international regenerative economy development, right? And so it's a little different for me that I maybe have like maybe 5 people right now that are close enough to me in Bogota that are in that circle, and then the rest are all over the place because I've been moving around and I've been really transient. So I think that's really cool. I'm also thinking of like, so as I'm looking at this challenge, there's 4 households just within my unit, right? And 3 of them are older, elderly. So I can see that different type of value or different type of needs for them compared to me, like you were mentioning before. I probably need a little bit more money-wise to support a family of 6 compared to everybody else in just this unit who has maybe some of them are elderly, just elderly couples are surrounding me, right? But I can also add different values that way. I'm also looking at the park behind me butts up against several people's. It's basically a dog park because most people have dogs here, and they're passing by and playing in the park with their dogs and children. There's a park over with a play area for the children. But there's also an area that butts up against the edge of another building that has a beautiful tall tree. And it looks like I wanted to, this was the idea, is to build a worm composting system in that area, because that's what I had before, is a worm composting system that I could just do my food waste into. But now it's not my property; it's someone else's. And before I was just doing it in a very suburban backyard, worm situation. But now if I go over there and I do it, now I have to work with and build trust with everybody else that's using that park in part that's in my backyard, right? So I'm wondering, what are some of the ways that maybe I know I'm going to reach out to your friend as well, Joe, but what are some of the ways that maybe I can even start building trust to do something in the backyard park, right? And I would love to get your feedback and how I might be able to build a financial system for that, right?
So much of it is know your neighbors. And I see John and Maria Elena both drop things in the chat. Would either of you like to just comment and share your thoughts? However you'd like to do that.
Yeah, I think John, your point is probably an answer to my point as well. My point was just that time is also an added dimension of complexity, because needs change over time and perception of need change over time, and that impacts trust. And so I think, the agility element of being able to reassess need and perception is also really important. But I think your point, John, answers that, because I think when people are collapse aware and collapse comes, there will be more agility in dealing with trust. And I think people can, shift their paradigm more quickly when there's a need.
Yeah, not much more to add. It's just something that's been arising in me and thinking about, like, one way to unify people and gifts and talents without resorting to hoarding and violence in times of collapse and scarcity is, it almost forces a novel way of trying to think about coming together at smaller to higher degrees of scale. The other thought that I had, recentering back in Penny's example too, is like a fundamental, and maybe Joshua in your case too, but it's like this fundamental need, like in order to create the conditions for trust, you have to throw yourself out there and embody a type of generosity that people see, and it becomes more contagious, and so like people to people work, body to body, showing up in the midst of people's need and suffering, to me is where I see like the conditions for trust really happening quickly.
Here. One thing I would add into this is that, building on what Maria Elena said, that there's a huge amount of research showing that the two basic psychological capacities for a successful life are the ability to regulate emotions and the psychological flexibility to try different perspectives on. And these are like foundational capacities of a healthy life. Also, as John was saying, in a time of collapse or in a time of disaster or a time of crisis, there are some people who have done the inner work to cultivate the ability to be agile and stay in relationship because of crisis. Like this group of people, it was mostly women plus Sergio, who self-organized their schedules around Penny's need at the hospital for 3 days. These were all very psychologically flexible people. And Sergio, the guy that was there, his wife couldn't go because they have a daughter that's just 6 months old, and the mother wasn't going to bring her 6-month-old to the hospital where there'd be risk, but the father could go. So it's like, so there's even more to the story than what I told. But this ability to be psychologically flexible and to manage our emotions is a foundational piece of being adaptive. And so building that is like the picture I showed of the mother and the baby is like part of where our ability to be psychologically flexible and to regulate our emotions is that our bodies physically co-regulate with our mothers through touch when we're children. And so it's like, it's fundamental. It's fundamental. And so building up the capacity to co-regulate, to basically to be emotional together with people, is part of the way that we both build trust and how trust gets expressed as different kinds of support between people. So it's very basic. It's like basic as in foundational. This part about the flexibility that you were talking about, Maria Ellen, it's really fundamental. And it's something we build before a crisis. We come into the crisis with these capacities. Or we come into a crisis with whatever capacities we have, is how it works. Because you're usually putting out fires during those times. Like people shifting their schedules around for Penny's medical crisis. It was very easy for everyone to do that because these are all adept community leaders. And community leaders are continually dealing with crises of some kind. That's what it means to be a leader, you know, in many ways. Is to be able to carry things forward in the midst of difficulties of various kinds. And so just want to name that piece too. And I'm curious about this question that I'd sort of implied or suggested. How are we building a regenerative finance system in the way I define one? How are we doing that just in this conversation right now? And what capacities are we building as value that could flow somewhere new that we didn't even think of before? Just curious what that brings up in you. Go for it, Chris.
The thought that popped into my mind immediately is just I think about what happens for all of us when, as we come into conversation, we bring ideas together, new insights emerge, and just thinking about those insights that otherwise wouldn't have been created on our own. That's value that we all take away, and then that whatever from this conversation really resonates, then it propagates out in our other relationships from this convening.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Anyone else?
Well, I can offer, I mean, I think the power of this community and others is just that. It's, I mean, to call us a community might be slightly premature, or I don't know, but communing, connecting is what we're doing here. And I gained so much from it, not least of which is both normalizing my own experience, building my own awareness, and borrowing courage even. So for example, I could just share that, Joshua, I know we didn't really answer your question, but I live in a, this, I think that we're all kind of like connecting at this level virtually, globally, with these big ideas and trying to practice regeneration, and then like confronting that in the most proximate way. And or at least, I am trying to bring it really down to the ground, because that to me is where the rubber really meets the road. But I mean, I am much more fluid in this conversation than I am in my own neighborhood so far. And I get tripped up on the daily about like where to start, how to do it, how to have the conversation, how to build trust. And I think about it all the time because I want to do it, but then I'm like, I just find myself hesitating constantly. And that's to say nothing of whatever regenerative finance remuneration, I mean, it's not even about any of that in my neighborhood context, but this connection, this normalization of our fears, our dreams, our wishes, our hopes, our vision for possible futures is, what feeds my soul in the conversations. And then the real work in the real world, in the material world, is where it gets really dicey. So I don't have answers. I'm just saying, like, I relate. And that's part of what is so critical about these kinds of conversations, is that I just feel so, it's just comforting somehow to know that we're all struggling on these various levels.
I was curious, Penny,
Enough.
if you're feeling up to it, you may be resting and listening in. But I was wondering if you might say something about your experiences in bringing some of these things into your life. And if you're resting, then no worries. I not to put you too much on the spot.
Yeah, I was sort of dozing a little. Um, I think, well, what I'm feeling right now with this group is as a flow is like a level of comfort. Like I'm actually just resting, listening to all of you and I'm feeling that rise up as a way of, I mean, it feels like a trust flow to me to be able to just rest with all of you and listen. And that's because of months and months of us being together, like, you know, especially like Maria Elena and Chris and Harry, and then now John is starting to, he was just here in Barichara, but I didn't get to meet him because I was in the hospital. And Joshua just coming in. So it's like even just that flow of starting to gain comfort with each other. It's a form of trust. And then what can happen when Joe realizes he knows somebody that could help Joshua with what he just said, you know, what he needs in Bogota. And yeah, that's what I'm feeling right now in this group is this level of the trust is building just through comfort, connection, and time. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Penny. I know one of the things that Penny and I see a lot because we show up into contexts differently than most people who are in the context. We show up coming from a slightly different place. Like when we're invited to do a bioregional activation, we're showing up from a very different place from people who live in a community. There's this we usually show up in a strange way, where what we're doing is unusual. And so that gives us particular strengths. You know, there are weaknesses to that, but there are particular strengths. And one of the strengths is that we get to sample what is working in a lot of places in a short amount of time. And so we get to see where, you know, generally this thing that is needed isn't working in a lot of places. And when it is, wow, it really stands out. You know, it's like that kind of a perspective. And one of the things that we've seen among at the sort of discourse level of people talking about bioregions and regeneration of the earth and these larger things is they're mostly talking about it, but not doing it. And then the people who are doing it are mostly not the ones that you hear talking about it. Like your crazy old permaculture lady who's got this 25-year-old farm and has been, like local people know that person because they get their produce from them or something, or their kids went to the Waldorf school that was there or whatever. But outside of that local community, no one hears about them because they're not speaking at that other level. And so we see these kinds of disconnect a lot. And it means that there need to be very conscientious people who are intermediaries, people who are chaperones between these different levels, but they do it with integrity. And we see a lot of need for that in the world right now because we see a lot of value that is stuck, that wants to flow. And we see a lot of value that is inadequate that needs to receive flow. And I've talked before in various contexts about older people who own land who would like to transition that land to younger people to steward it. As an example of this whole land-based capital worth trillions of dollars globally, completely stuck because the specific local trust relationships are not in place. This person or this couple or this family does not know who to give their land to. it's hyper specific in each case and very generic as a universal need. And so this kind of mismatch is very common. We see this mismatch as being common. And so just to be able to see value and see that the basis of value flowing is trust in human relationships is a massive breakthrough. It's like, oh my God, not only do I see all the value, but I'm no longer frustrated that it's all lost because I can feel where the potential is. The potential's in the human relationships. So are you good at making friends? Are you good at working with people? Are you good at trusting? It's this kind of stuff that actually becomes the thing that makes the difference. So you see how empowering it is. It's so incredibly empowering. Penny, I see I've prompted something in you.
Well, there's something I was thinking about this group, and the part about the stored value and how there's so much stored value in this group, but it's not totally visible to all of us yet. Like, I wonder if we need to be sharing, like each of us at some point sharing more in more depth our stories and like what we're needing and what we're looking for related to regenerative finance, what we're seeing, where we are in our contexts, and that it might start to make the value visible, the stored value in each of us visible, where we could start to then see how do we work together, in a more synergistic way going forward. So I was thinking about that stored value and it not being totally visible in this group yet.
I want to add something that's visible to me as an example of this. Because as you were talking, I was like looking for an example by looking at the screen. And I was like, I have really valued that I know Maria Elena has a history as a dancer, that Chris has done martial arts and body-based meditation work, and that John has done martial arts and body-based work. And this is something I've come to know about each of you in very different contexts. But I know that all of us as people who have done those different kinds of body-based training, there are things I could lean on in this group, even though more of you may have it that I don't know. But just knowing that as an example of what Penny was saying. Like I've been a dancer to a much lesser extent than you have, Maria Elena, but I have. Did it for a couple of years. So I can sense the depth of what your body knows from having done it for longer than I have. And John was telling me this morning about a time when he was studying martial arts in Japan. And I'm like, I can feel into what that means. And I know Chris has done martial arts. So now Chris and John could like hang out and talk about martial arts. But you see, like, just because I know that there are several people in this group that I could make reference to body-based practice that you would all completely get. And then we could scaffold something from that. Because body-based practice is a huge deal for this work. It's a really big part of this work, actually. So for me to know that and to know that there are several people just in I named half the people in the group, right? And I didn't mention that Penny did body-based trauma healing work. I could have gone on, but I just wanted to make some sort of like a simple example of the point. It has gradually become visible to me through people's stories, through my interactions with their stories, some elements of connection that we have that I know are really significant. And that I could leverage into strategy if I needed to at some point, because I could call forth that capacity in our group. And so, and as a facilitator, I would be thinking, how could I facilitate the emergence of capacities among us? But in general, building a regenerative economy is this kind of work. It's seeing the potentials and helping the relationships configure themselves so the flows can happen. So I was just really struck by that. Go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to share that, I think one of the things that I really love about this community is what it helps me with, which is really kind of bridging these scales. So, for example, I feel like I really resonate with what you just said not too long ago here, Joe, of like dipping into the LinkedIn universe. And I feel like I'm kind of watching all the animals in this habitat kind of signaling to one another. And then and I'm just trying to, basically as a relative outsider, I'm trying to watch the conversations and understand like who's actually even worth listening to. And then I feel like I'm seeing a number of parties who they're probably just trapped in kind of the intellectual exercise. And then I see the output being either, you know, conference talks or PDFs where it's like a re-articulation of the things that we already know of like, here are the, you know, the 10 hard problems that we need to solve, right? And I'm just like, great. Like I'm over here trying to just in my own little way chip away at some of these hard problems, right? I'm like, where are the people who are actually trying to crack these nuts? Like I don't need yet another PDF document articulating that. And so it's such a joy to come into this community and be with folks who also are on that path of like trying to create something, right? And build relationships on the ground, but then simultaneously being able to come back to this community. And as you so brilliantly articulated, Joe, over the course of like the learning journey that we've just been going through, it's been so beneficial for me to have your kind of clear articulation of frameworks and mental models that we can use to think about doing this work and thinking at multiple scales. Because again, for me, it's been a homecoming because I feel like I'm the guy that shows up with 10 heads when I'm talking about like, well, we need we need to think at larger scales here. And people just kind of look at me like deer in headlights. Like, I don't know what to do with that, you know? So anyway, I just wanted to share that's for me personally, that having a place to come home where folks are, again, just they're trying to get after it in whatever small way on the ground, but they're also, you know, trying to hold the bigger picture. Like, well, how do we actually need to coordinate to really get an effect at a much larger scale here so that we have some chance of kind of meeting what's coming at us?
Hmm. Well, one thing that was part of the initial motivation to create the design school was this idea that the school should actually, like the classroom, you know, as it were, the place where learning happens, should be in the landscapes themselves as much as possible. So we have this online learning space and lots of great online learning happens, but we really want it to be in service to the landscapes. Like we want Maria Elena to be able to come here and then take it back to France. And like, we want it to do that. And so we started with that idea. And then Penny and I were traveling to a lot of landscapes. So we were getting that, but it was difficult to transfer what we were learning back to the online space. We succeeded some of it, but nothing remotely like what Maria Ellen, I'm sure what you just experienced in the last 3 days, how much you learned by this physical meeting of people is just so rich. So one of the things that I'm going to name in the closing webinar of the learning journey next week, as part of the direction the school is going, is that we see sort of the next evolutionary stage of the design school is to help support local people to organize their own immersions in their own landscapes to bring other members of the design school. So it's like, oh, as the design school, as a design school member, you could organize an event in your own community and invite people from anywhere on earth through the design school to come to your community so that we can actually learn in each other's landscapes. Now, obviously, there's going to be constraints. It costs money. People have to buy airline tickets, et cetera. But because we're already practicing clustering ourselves geographically, like people all over Western Europe could travel to France to see Maria Elena because it's not that hard. Whereas if you're in New Mexico, maybe you choose not to go there, but maybe you could. So, you know, it's very specific in that sense. But the more we anchor by geography, the more it's easier to say, oh, well, in the next few months, I'm actually going to be going to Germany for this conference. I could jump down to that thing in France, even though I live in Canada, you know? And so just by having calendars with like these things starting to happen and having a coherence to what they are, that, oh, it's a similar, you know, each one's unique, but there's a similar quality to, like, what does it mean to organize an immersion? Some people are really good at organizing these things. They don't, Maria Elena doesn't need me to help her design something. You're organizing them already. But other people would be like, I've never done that. Could you help me? And so part of the learning is to see how someone else did it or to attend someone else's. And so I see this as like where we're going in a way is more and more into the earth, but into the earth through our bioregions. And then as we do that, a lot of this stuff becomes more powerful because it's just amazing how different it is. When I sat with John last week, even though I had dengue, we met for an hour and a half. They sat here, and he and his wife Camila sat here in my house. Just for us to sit together is completely different than being on Zoom. So I already know John better than I did before because of that. And so Penny and I got to, see people below the Zoom box as we travel. And we always sort of laugh at how everyone's so quirky, everyone's so unique. Their bodies tell us things that they wouldn't have told us on Zoom, and things that we just love. Like it's like you finally get to know the person in a way. And it's so beautiful. And we know it's an important part of the pedagogy of what we're doing. Like pedagogically, we need to come together in each other's communities to actually know each other. And so we're going to start encouraging that and showing how the design school membership dues can actually become like a travel support fund for people to attend each other's events for those who need it. So we're going to start rolling that out, because we're getting to a level now where we have like $1,500 a month coming in from membership dues. And that's not very much money, but it's enough to support travel stipends for people who need it if design school members are organizing local events. And so we're going to start to build scaffolding of coordination between design school members and local events organized by design school members. We know that's part of the direction we need to go. For exactly the reasons we're talking about now. It's going to build all these relationships between us. It's going to make them so much stronger. And then we're going to know things like what I said about all of the body-based practitioners on this call. We're going to know things beyond what you would learn otherwise. Things that come up when you're having a beer at a local pub or when you're taking a walk through a garden together. Things that are super valuable, but that we wouldn't realize are valuable until they came up. So I just want to name that part of this because the limitations of digital are pretty obvious once you go back to physical. Then you're like, oh my God, we're like working on 5% of capacity for human relationships. You sort of, this is what COVID did for us, is it isolated the hell out of us. And then we all got to be shocked by remembering by coming back together. And so we see this as part of the key scaffolding. Yeah.
If I can just add, Joe, that on the flip side, look at us. We're from all over the world sitting around this table, and that would not happen without digital. So it's also very, very, very powerful. And I've noticed since COVID, because people are much more comfortable sitting on a Zoom call than they were before, there's a lot more cross-pollination happening. So that's also very powerful. So I think it's really the combination of the two that is amazingly powerful. I think the other thing I want to say is every day I'm in my bioregion, I'm blown away by the momentum that's already there. Every time I talk to a new person and tell them what we're doing, they're like, oh my gosh, I love it. I want to join. I want to help. Or I did something similar, or I'm doing something similar. So there's a lot of energy already in place. And you just have to find it. You just have to find it and then leverage it and get it to, work with the, get people to work with each other. And it's a lot of work because we're finding we don't have enough resources to do everything we see as possible to do. And I don't mean financial, I mean people. We just don't have enough people. Financial, of course, that would be helpful as well, but really it's the people that we need right now more than the money.
Well, on that point, and maybe this could be a point to bring us to a close. Yesterday, Penny and I had a really powerful meeting with Tanya and Ceci. And Tanya and Ceci have been on the team that is holding all of the work of syntropic agroforestry for our territory for the last 2 years. And so they've gotten to see all of the limitations of what they can accomplish. And we just helped bring funding to Barichara that arrived in July, including part of this funding is for syntropic. And Tanya and Ceci and the rest of their team are sitting there very frustrated with money to hire someone, but they don't have the person with the right criteria to actually build a syntropic garden. And we talked for like an hour around the intricacies of that. How it wasn't the money. They're now like sitting twiddling their thumbs on a pile of money. Like, we know what we need to do with it, but until we have the right person, what can we do? And so, because there's a very particular combination of hard manual labor to build an agroforestry system, but also articulate that can communicate and teach, that would rather be doing this instead of construction, etc. And so it's like, and in our specific cultural context, there are specific cultural attractors that take the kind of people we'd want away from this. So we might identify them, but they don't want to do it. And so we can't find the right person, or they can't find the right person. And so the money wasn't the issue there. Very specifically, they received the money, now they're trying to find the person. It's like that clear that it's not the money. Penny.
I just I saw I saw Joshua wanted to say something earlier, so I want to just point that out so he can say something in a moment. But I wanted to just agree with Maria Elena about it's the combination right now in this, like with the internet age, because that's what the design school, like the purpose of the design school is the learning exchange between bioregions, and that wouldn't be possible without the internet. And it's part of, it's part of what Joe wrote about in the book in the design pathway, is that we need the network of bioregions now to be able to communicate with each other, and for as long as we can, and until and if it all crashes. But like, as long as we can be having this interchange, I think it's key to have that connection across the bioregions. So Joshua, I saw you.
Thank you. I know we're at time or over time, so I just wanted to mention I'm going to Gathering of Tribes, which I think Victor Borsky and his team, who kind of founded the Gathering of Tribes, they're renaming it the Gathering. But I honestly think, Joe, if you haven't run into Victor or the Gathering of Tribes, I think it would be really cool for a connection between the two of you and your two organizations, because I feel like that's what they're doing, is trying to bring gathering around these groupings of people in different bioregions together for those learnings in place in physical space together, and they're doing it in a very open space as well, and using open technology, and I really respect them for doing that. So I'm wondering if there's any way that we can already combine what others are already working on, especially those just kind of solve that challenge that you were talking about, Joe. And I think Victor Vorsky and what they're doing at the Gathering is definitely a piece to be connected here.
Totally agree. And I know Victor and I love their work. My big challenge personally is to choose where I travel with all the constraints, and the fact that Penny and I have had health problems that are pretty chronic throughout this year. Mainly, I think, because of the amount of, we've been traveling 50% of the time for the last 2 years. We're like traveling a lot. And so we're starting to reduce it, but I'm beginning to get invited to different gatherings, which I used to do. I used to be like a keynote speaker and go to gatherings and stuff. And I actually have stopped doing that in the last few years. But I'm sensing, and what you're saying right now sort of re-invokes it, that Penny and I do need to travel strategically to some key gatherings for the sake of building coherence across our efforts, just to meet and connect with people. But Penny and I don't yet have good heuristics about how to make those decisions, because we're in a sort of deep inquiry in ourselves of changing how we travel right now. So we're trying to figure it out. But because there's so much going on, it's sort of like there's too much going on. And so our human limitations are really important in this. But yeah, I think that you're right, that there's sort of like the specific version of Penny and I, should be collaborating with the Gathering with Victor Horsky specifically. And more generally, we should have coordination strategies for different people to go to different communities to build coherence, so that we have more of this coherence building, because it's so needed. And I'd say in the next 2 or 3 years, It's critical. It's critical that
So-
we're strategic about it. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to
No,
interrupt.
go ahead,
but
Kim. Go ahead.
I really appreciate that, Joe. And I'm just thinking, first of all, I didn't get to say this earlier, but I just want to say how grateful I am that it seems to me that you're both recovering, which, yeah, is wonderful to see. And Penny, I hope you're fully recovered soon. And just in that vein, like, how might we, be ambassadors so that, because I think, first of all, like in my case, I'm trying to travel less just out of sensitivity to like what we're all trying to do here, right? So how might we have a distributed network within the design school that can help you scale yourselves? I mean, we can never be you representing the organization at quite the same in quite the same way as you can, but like, is there a way that we could all be in apprenticeship so that we can, in a distributed way, be doing this weaving? Because I know I'm already doing it like on some level just by virtue of the fact that I'm in like these 10 different, you know, communities, and I'm trying to like cross pollinate, and I'm sure you're all doing the same. So I think that's something that could be worth exploring if you're open to it.
I have a specific example of this that's just come up in the last month or so. Just Penny and I met with Annalika about her work with constellations and how she could bring it into the design school. And as we had different meetings with her about that, one of the ideas that came up was Annalika is very happy to travel anywhere to do an in-person constellation, but she may need help with financial support for travel, like to buy an airline ticket or something. But she's this asset. She's this amazing person with this capacity to come into a space and help support collective sense making. And so we're like, oh, that would be a cool thing to do as the design school, is to actually have some pooling of money to send Annalika to groups to do constellations. And we immediately thought of Neil Davidson as an example of someone he's so good at seeing strategic things and creating diagrams of them. For him to just sit in a room and be part of a conversation and do that for someone, it's the kind of thing you would pay these high-powered consultants to do. But wouldn't it be great if we could just send Neil Davidson to places? And so you can see at a meta level, there's a pattern there. If there are people who want to be doing that, who want to be sort of deployed into bioregions, as it were, to be able to have the mechanisms for those, because these are not going to be very many people that are actually looking to do that specific thing. It's something that's very conceivable that could become part of the design school, is that we could find a way to pool enough financial resources to basically make people available to travel to help bioregions to do things that bioregions can either help match the funding for, or if they don't have the funding because they're early stage, they still get the help they need. You see, so I see this sort of apprenticeship idea is really powerful, and specific, very unique and strong skills that some of the members of the design school already have that would be immediately valuable to just show up on your doorstep and help. That they come out and, are with you for a few days. And so I think there's something about that, bringing it to the landscapes that we can all think about together. So I think it's an amazing idea. And I think it's very appropriate to the stage of our development as a school to be talking about it now. So I know that we're over our scheduled time, but it's such a rich conversation. I think maybe what I would want to say in closing, just to sort of summarize, is we now have very clear examples of how trust is the engine. I'm mixing my metaphors here, of a living system. Playfully breaking my metaphors there, because engines are not living systems. But in a really profound way, trust is the energetic dynamic of it that makes an economy possible for humans. And so I'm so glad that we're here doing it together. I'm so glad that we're discovering new horizons, like apprenticeships and these other things that are starting to come up. These are new horizons for us to explore and create together. And then for us to see, like, oh, in my bioregion, I could actually ask this of the design school community as we cultivate it, because I see that it's within the web of relationships of what we're doing. So I want that to just become more visible as we go, so that we can each be in service to each other in better ways. So thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. It's just been beautiful. And it's great to see you all instead of just being here alone, sleeping on the, you know, or whatever it's been for our weird lives in the last couple of weeks. It's great to see you all again.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank
All right.
you.
Take care, everyone.
Ciao.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Ciao.